Hello and welcome to another edition of Media Watch. We're your co-hosts. I'm Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony. Good to see you, Eric.
Hey, Bob. Back for another go-around. Brought to you by EVT Educational Productions and the good graces of Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Bob, what's still dominating the news, or will be still dominating the news when we air on Monday, is of course Ukraine, the Crimea, the referendum for annexation. So, what's your take?
Well, as we speak, Russia has just announced that it had officially annexed the Crimea section of Ukraine, and
they have done their vote to
right.
say, yes, we've invited you to our federation.
Exactly.
Okay.
And of course, the whole premise of having a referendum one day that suddenly turns into an annexation the next day is just it's just too unreal for me to deal with. But that's exactly what's happened. Russia has announced that the eastern section, the southern section,
Crimea.
Yes, has been annexed.
Crimea, the
yes.
Crimean Peninsula.
The pro-Russian
Crimean Peninsula,
right.
Or what's commonly known as the Crimea.
Exactly.
Has officially come under their fold, into their fold.
And is officially part of Russia. Whatever officially means to the international community is a lot different than what it means to Putin at this point.
Right. As you're saying, I know there are a number of sanctions that have been announced. But as we discussed in the previous edition, the difficulty of sanctions, of course, and the difficulty of saber rattling about the Crimea is quite actually difficult because
right.
the Russians are, as much as people want to say we're reverting to the Cold War days, not quite that way, because economically, the Russians are enmeshed in Europe's economy. They're enmeshed in the global economy. And so there are things that can be done that might prove effective or not, but the Russians don't really want to totally drop back into the old Iron Curtain days.
No.
Because economically it wouldn't be.
It doesn't work,
right.
And they know that.
Right.
It would be economically, it would be a disaster.
Right. But of course, with folks like John McCain and Lindsey Graham calling for more U.S. force, the Russians just shake their head. The Europeans go, what? No, I don't think we want to go down that road. And the president, Barack Obama, understands quite well that the people in the United States of America are not ready to go to war with anyone, not Syria, not whomever.
Right, and it's, as we were discussing before we went on air, this is really a very complex situation. It is not as black and white as some of the media reports purport it to be.
Good point. Since we're called Media Watch, let's make some references, as you said, because there's an interesting report. Let's quote the right folk. Yeah, here we go. Mainstream U.S. media is lost in Ukraine. Written by a gentleman by the name of Robert Parry for Consortium News, which I believe is an online outlet. And basically his take is the Washington Post, the New York Times, most mainstream media are basically playing lockstep to the U.S. government propaganda machine about what's going on in Ukraine. And he calls the, quote, refashioned legitimate regime, which then called the interim government, and now Ukraine. He's using those, quote, references to how the current administration is referring to the coup that took place in Ukraine. And Bob, let's remind our viewers about the coup, in that it was an uprising because the president who fled decided he was going to align himself with the European Union and what was it, the bulk of central Ukraine and the western part of the country were in favor of that.
Exactly. The western part of the country was in favor of signing the documents that would have put them closer
to the EU,
officially joining the European Economic Union.
Right. But the president decided.
He decided he wasn't going to do that.
Right.
And
he was going to more align himself with Vladimir Putin and the Soviet and the Russian
right.
entity. And the folks
and there
in
was an uprising.
Kiev rose up and started to revolt. Now, as we've since dug into it and learned, yeah, it was a revolt, and it was about trying to get a democratic form of dealing with the issue, but it may have had a many-faceted side to it.
Right. I mean, it's far from an established government because we have a coup here. We have a president that was chased out of the nation. We have a government that was basically slapped together from the people who won the argument, so to speak. But that's what exists today, and that's the part of the establishment there that that the U.S. is backing.
Well, the interesting thing about it is Parry's point that he's trying to make is that most of the people behind that coup were basically neo-Nazi folk who used some jackbooted tactics to help foment this revolution.
Right.
And so what he's claiming is that the New York Times and the Washington Post are, quote, whiting out the brown shirts, these neo-Nazis who may or may not have been behind the coup.
Right.
And
there may have been a sprinkling. There might have been elements, but not to the extent.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean,
right.
And part of the problem that we have, and which is when he says mainstream U.S. media is lost in Ukraine, is guess what, folk? In the old days, there may have been a Moscow bureau that was staffed by mainstream media.
Yes.
I'm not sure they still have Moscow bureaus in Washington Post, New York Times territory, or are they just parachuting people in? And when you don't have knowledgeable people on the ground, you have no way of really delineating. They definitely would not have had a Ukraine bureau, so they would have to parachute in anyway.
Right.
And so getting the actual correct facts and behind-the-scene background of who the players are is what's so difficult. And so the instance that Parry is quoting is that there was a sniper incident where a lot of the demonstrators got shot, and that was the final straw. And the party line from the U.S. government was that those were the Russian-backed despots who were trying to take the country to Russia, and so they blamed that on them. And then, as a result, when the other people overthrew them, they instantly thought they were the good guys in the white hats, and they instantly recognized them.
And as this article, this is a fairly good article, says, it's not as black and white as that. I love the last graph here, if I might quote it quickly. Yet the danger of false narratives, as the American people saw in Iraq and almost revisited in Syria, is that policies, including warfare, can be driven by myth, not by fact. The real story of Ukraine is far more complex than the black and white caricature that the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others are presenting. It is in the truthful grays that responsible policies are shaped and bloody miscalculations are avoided. I really kind of like that last little statement he makes. Yeah,
I think that gives you a reason to take pause and step back. And it's interesting because there are very few people of color covering the Ukraine situation, probably little or none. In the old days, you might have had a Hal Walker from ABC News, from his Bond Bureau, who might have gone in, and even Bill Whitaker, who used to be in the Tokyo Bureau for CBS News. He's
done some world travel.
He might have been somebody that they might have put in there. But Eugene Robinson, the African-American columnist for the Washington Post, was interestingly enough, smart enough to take a step back and talk about the same thing, because Richard Prince, in his journalisms of March 17th, actually had a nice quote on that. He said, basically, Eugene Robinson wrote last week about neo-Nazi political activity in Ukraine. He says, Alexander Tait, one of 3 vice prime ministers, is a member of the controversial all-Ukrainian Union Svoboda party, whose leader charged that Ukraine was being controlled by, quote, Muscovite Jewish mafia before last month's revolution. Members of Svoboda also run the Agriculture and Environment Ministries. Last year, the World Jewish Congress called on the European Union to consider banning what it considered neo-Nazi parties, including Svoboda. But Robinson added, it's not fair to say that the new government is dominated by the far right.
Right.
But the front and center presence of these unsavory characters should be enough to warn policymakers in Washington that Ukraine's new leaders will have to be pressed to respect the rights of all citizens, including supporters of the ousted regime.
Exactly, right.
And
Perfect
so,
example of how things aren't as pure and clean as we would like to report it.
Not as clear-cut, not as, quote, black and white. And Robinson is a long-time Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist who is with the Washington Post. So not everyone at the Washington Post is running lockstep into the administration's line. And that's why folks like us at Media Watch try to also bring it to your attention. It's not just cut and dried. There, as we said last show, there are a number of historical reasons why the Crimea would lean towards Russia.
Sure.
And as people keep forgetting, Russia, the then Soviet Union, gave the Crimea to Ukraine, 20 years ago. So it's not as if that's an untoward thing for the Crimean predominant Russian-speaking, Russian-leaning population to actually vote to go towards Russia.
Absolutely.
It may not even be a Putin-influenced vote, even though there seem to have been some Russian troops floating around the polling place, which is why it's a very tricky thing to report.
Right.
And so our advice for our Media Watch viewers is, it's not cut and dried. And Bob, what did you say a little while ago? The gray areas?
The gray areas are, it is in the truthful grays that responsible policies are shaped and bloody miscalculations are avoided. I just like that line.
And we give Robert Parry of Consortium News
little credit
for that observation. Yes. So we know that story will be percolating.
Right. As Russia basically moves in and creates a new border and officially puts in troops and infrastructure, we'll see how that evolves.
Right.
There'll be pushback globally, of course, but we'll see how that gets reported. I know the UK on the other side of the Ukraine is keeping an eye on things just to see if there's any influence on the pro-EU side, making sure there are no, I don't think the Russians are going to send any troops to that side, but just keeping an eye on things.
Basically, the, quote, international community are trying to put their hats together on how they can do some kind of curbing of Putin's moves, whether he's trying to destabilize the rest of Ukraine so that Ukraine can actually become a failed state and then he can then easily annex some more parts of it, or whether the EU, in conjunction with the rest of the international community, can put a hard brake to what his possible plans might be. That's what's going to be worked out within the next couple of weeks, not days.
Right.
So it's a story we're going to have to keep an eye on, folk, and we predict that there will be more twists and turns.
Yes. It's not cut and dry.
Right. So we're going to segue and take a step back from the breaking news stuff, just because at certain times in the existence of our show, certain confluences occur where topics just sort of come together that deal with what our show is all about, which is Media Watch, and Media Watch that impacts people of color, communities of color, and issues that impact on communities of color. And let's talk a little bit, Bob, about some of the things that have popped up within the last couple of weeks that should have a bearing, will have a bearing, or at least are worth discussing.
Well,
so start with, you go.
Well, here again, before we went on air, we were talking about some of the people who were doing new things on air, or people who had been named to new positions. And of course, 60 Minutes was sort of the holy grail of
news magazine shows.
Right.
Yes.
And they just picked up, they just signed Bill Whitaker, a longtime veteran. I guess you're familiar with much of his work.
Oh yeah, he's been with 60 Minutes. I think he started with them back in the 90s, and as we said earlier, numerous assignments, Tokyo Bureau. He worked out of LA. He's fact out of LA now, but he will be moving to New York. And come this fall, he will be in one of those regular 60-minute chairs. And for me, that's significant because that's a permanent assignment. And when Byron Pitts was doing his little stint for 60 Minutes, it was always one of these rotational catch-can.
Right, we would see different people given the particular week or the subject
Yeah,
matter.
but there was, since the late, great Ed Bradley wasn't in that chair, there was never a person of color back in that seat to deal with some of the issues and stories that we feel have been missing. And maybe now that Bill Whitaker's got a permanent slot, we may see more of those. So that's part of this, confluence of constellations of things that's taking place that may have a bearing on how news is being covered at the networks and in the larger sphere. Along those lines, Don Lemon at CNN has now been tabbed to get a, quote, tryout.
Right.
Not a permanent slot, not a chair, it's a tryout at a new show at 10 o'clock, a weekly show.
I believe
What's it going to be called, Bob?
I'll look it up while we're speaking.
Okay.
But yeah, at least it'll be an opportunity for 5 weeks. Did you say 5 weeks running?
Yeah, I believe it's a 5-week tryout, and that would, if memory serves me correctly, and I didn't do the research, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, that would make Don Lemon the only person of color in the CNN primetime lineup.
Right, if you can call that hour.
Well, I guess it is. No, it's 10 o'clock, isn't
yes.
it? It's a 10
It is
yeah, that's still
prime time.
prime time. 10 o'clock still
towards
prime
the back
time.
end, but
yes, but yes, that would make Don Lemon the only person of color in the CNN primetime lineup, and they're giving it to him as a tryout. Reminds me of the days when I was supposedly given the tryout at the ABC foreign assignment desk by my immediate supervisor, and he says, "Oh yeah, well it's yours unless you lose it or whatever." I mean,
Right.
it was so backhand, and I just shook my head and said, "Yeah, okay, fine, yeah, till I lose it." But I had to actually go toe to toe and say, "Excuse me, I'm your senior assignment editor. That's my job."
That's your job.
Yes. So the Don Lemon tryout means no matter how many times things change, they still stay the same.
Yes. But it's a shot.
I wish
It's a clean
Don,
shot.
I wish him well, and hopefully he will succeed. And he'll have enough ratings because everything's still driven by ratings.
right. That's going to be the bottom line
Yep.
here. We hope. We
That
hope it doesn't
indeed.
get into internal office politics. We hope it sticks with whether he has the ratings or not.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we'll see how well he does. But I
We'll
do wish
see.
him luck
Yeah.
in that enterprise.
And actually in the grassroots, Columbia School of Journalism, one of the premier journalism schools in the country. Your good buddy Sri had a position there before he went to the Metropolitan. What was Sri's
Yes.
title there?
Well, Sri was the dean of students at the Columbia Journalism School, and then he evolved into the chief digital officer of the entire
Right.
university.
Right.
But now he's left that position and he's gone to the Metropolitan Museum to be its chief digital officer. He's still a big social media force in the city,
Right.
but Columbia obviously ended up with a few slots in its roster to fill in, and apparently one of them, not the same position he had, but one of them got filled in.
Dean of Students at the Columbia J School.
But yeah, that's what Tree was, I believe. The
Academic Dean is the new position
Yes.
that Sheila Coronel,
Yes.
who used to be, I think, the executive director of the Philippine investigative arm that helped bring down one of those not so
Yes.
upright presidents of the
Yes.
Philippines. They've just named her the academic
dean, which
at
is
the
a
Columbia.
very powerful position,
and
very influential among the journalists in the city.
You are grooming the next generation journalists. You are interacting with the actual working journalists in the New York metropolitan area.
Right, and I'm particularly proud. I didn't go to the journalism school, but I am a Columbia alum, so I'm quite happy when I see things like that happen.
I'm always happy when there's someone of color that's been placed into these journalism schools, because they tend to be a little bit more sensitive and do a lot more outreach to get more students of color into their pipeline. I mean, that's just a known fact. I'm not saying anything out of school.
No.
So, and what we try to do at Media Watch, folks, is just state things as they are. We don't try to propaganda. We try not to editorialize, but when we do, we tell you, okay, this is our commentary for the program.
Absolutely. We'll let you know when it's opinion, but we try to dig in as best we can.
And as accurately as we can.
And of course, it's going to be subjective sometimes. You and I can't.
Well, we bring our baggage with us,
Yes.
and part of the baggage is having worked in this industry for as long as we have. We've seen it from the inside, not just outside looking in. And now we're outside, inside, monitoring it to help you digest it as best we can. The other diversity, because we're looking at diversity overall, right?
Right.
Okay, let's use a little visual prop. Trouble in startup land. Ta-da! That was the headline on the previous Sunday's New York Times Magazine. We use that just as a prop because startup land basically is short term for online new media stuff. And so, Bob, let's run down the new startups that are coming and what we consider, what other people consider the trouble in startup land.
Well, I cover a lot of, that, I cover a lot of technology and a lot of tech events, and I end up going to a lot of these events where startups show off their new services, their new goods, their new software, or what have you.
Yep.
And a lot of the new startups I've seen, I get to meet the people, aren't diverse. And that's one of the issues that's being dealt with. Bill Keller, the former editor at the New York Times,
Right.
has a new startup coming. And one of the issues that was brought up to him by a number of people, including the National Association of Black Journalists, was the lack of diversity. And Bill had something to say about that.
Oh yeah, according to the article that I think he did the interview with
I will cue it up.
Richard Prince. He says
Yes.
yes.
Bill Keller was responding to an inquiry directly from
Yes.
Richard Prince and Journalisms.
Yeah.
Journal-isms. Go Google that. It's good stuff.
Yeah, the bottom line was they said, what are you going to do about diversity? And he said, look, we need to be diverse because we're going to be doing a lot of stuff with the criminal justice system. And unfortunately, as we all know, the preponderance of folk caught up in the criminal justice system are people of color. He was very direct and honest about knowing what his playing field is and is going to be. And he said, on that note alone, he needs to have as diverse a staff as possible. And you can't get more forthright than that. And so I'm going to take him at his word. And what we need to do is see how he staffs that new startup.
I agree with you. I've heard Bill Keller. I've seen some of the moves that he made when he was at the New York Times. Didn't always agree with everything he did, but I'm willing to give him a chance on this because he's, if nothing else, he's direct and he's straightforward.
Right.
And that's all I can ask from him at this point. I don't expect anybody to hook up folks just for the sake of numbers. He's going to get a quality staff as best he can, but he's making clear that diversity will be part of this new criminal justice related startup.
No, there's no two ways about it. But there were some interesting headlines that popped up on Richard Prince's journalism. This was a chock full of stuff.
Yes, he always does a good job.
And on this diversity issue, just to quote some of those headlines, Bob, can you bring them up?
Well, I'll cue them as we. Well, he talks about. The Emily Bell one.
Yeah. Let's see.
Emily Bell got quoted a number of places, and she goes into the fact that a number of these startups.
Some of the startups she mentioned was Nate Silver, 538.
Specifically, the journalism-related startups.
Yes, Ezra Klein, Vox Media.
Right, and those are well-funded, well-respected startups. And she calls them out by name, and the National Association of Black Journalists wrote a letter to some of these startups just to put them on notice that they'll be watched.
Yeah, Emily's piece was done in the Columbia Journalism Review, and the headline was very interesting. It was something like, "Diversity or lack thereof in journalism startups."
Diversity or lack thereof,
in
yes.
journalism
It
startups.
just came up as you said that.
And then Amanda Hess wrote for Slate, her headline, "The online journalism revolution will produce more powerful white men." So she doesn't expect much diversity.
Yes.
So I chuckle because there's been an ongoing attempt to just bring this issue to the fore for all these online places like Huffington Post and all these other giant aggregators who seem to be having trouble finding people of color to hire for their staff. And we find at Media Watch the same old tired trope. We can't find any.
Right.
And it's tiresome. So the fact that these new online startups are being called on what their plans are before they get out of the gate practically.
Right, as they
refreshing.
collect their initial staff.
Yeah.
We end up coming in on the back end after the business
after
is
the
established.
deal is done, yes.
And then there'll be it's
we
open.
don't have any slots and
Right.
we can't do, and then, which the same old, it always boils down to, oh, we couldn't find any at the time, but now the slots are all filled. But it's interesting when I say the confluence of things that occur, because speaking of diversity,
And we're getting down to about a minute and a half left, but go ahead.
New York Times Sunday Review, front page of the Sunday Review, another color illustration I'll just put before you. And it says, "Where are the people of color in children's books?" Another media avenue, another media trail that needs to be blazed because it's been overlooked. And there were over 3,000 children's books that came out in 2013.
Okay.
Take a guess at how many had people of color in the titles or on the cover or about people
I'm
of
guessing
color.
it's abysmally low.
93.
That's not good at all.
93. So, look, publishing is not any better, generic general publishing, than children's publishing. The magazine business, not any better than the newspaper business or the broadcasters. So we got about 39, 40 seconds
30
left.
seconds,
so we might as well wrap it up.
But I am going to say that the book expo is coming to New York in a few weeks, and I'm going to keep an eye on that. I'm going to talk to a few black authors and see what their experiences were.
Very
as
good.
We have about 20 seconds left.
So, folks, we're about to wrap it up. Thanks for joining us. I'm Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony. It's been a very good discussion.
Yes, and hey, what can we say? Thanks, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, EBT Educational Productions. We'll catch you the next time.